Welcome to the Law School Insider, where we have conversations with students, lawyers, and employers.
Succeeding in law school is something that you must prepare for, not only before you begin, but throughout your law school journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. I am your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I will draw from my over 20 years of experience in the college admission field, as well as bring forth the experiences of others as we delve deeper into the issues. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Law School Insider. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I'm so excited to be able to have you back again this week. This week, we are bringing you Brendan Beery, who is a professor of law at Western Michigan University Cooley Law School. And this week, we're going to do something a little bit different. In the past, we've talked a lot about law school success, and that's what this show is all about. But part of your success is also understanding some of the core areas of law that you are going to be looking at as a law student. And one of those areas is constitutional law. If you live in the United States, there is a lot of questions about constitutional law that are coming up right now, especially with some of the decisions that have been made in the executive branch. And Professor Beery recently wrote a great blog post that I'm going to link in the notes today that talk about the executive powers and what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. And after reading that myself, I knew that this was something that we should talk about here on the show to give you a better understanding and kind of a primer of what is to come for yourself when you come to law school. So Professor Beery, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
You know, it is my pleasure to have you here today. And this is definitely a really interesting area because, especially in today's time and age, there's a lot happening, especially here in the United States, with the decisions that are being made by the president and people questioning whether it is constitutional or not and whether it is legal or not. And you wrote a great article kind of looking into this specific area. And I guess let's step back a little bit and talk about the executive powers and some of the foundational aspects of what you were talking about in your article itself. And then we'll kind of go from there.
The executive power comes from Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And really, the executive, unlike Congress, kind of handy when the founders decided to create Congress and give Congress its power, they actually gave us a list in Article 1 of specific things Congress is allowed to regulate and allowed to do. But when it comes to the president in Article 2, there's no list. The Article 2 simply makes the president the chief executive of the United States and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So courts have been left to struggle with the meaning of the word executive. And what they've come up with is, well, of course, that the root of the word executive is execute. And so the fundamental role of the executive is not to make law, but to execute the law. And that's the fight that we often get into when we look at executive power. If the president is making law, then that's something he's not supposed to do. If the president is merely executing law, well, that's exactly what he is supposed to be doing. So with regard to the latest executive order, there have been quite a few executive orders, but the most famous or infamous, depending on one's perspective, thus far has been the travel ban from the 7 named nations from the Middle East region. What opponents of the executive order are saying that in signing that executive order, the president was essentially getting out of his lane and making law, whereas the president, of course, is arguing that he was merely executing law. So you can see that the president's power is actually largely tied to Congress. And that's where that blog piece that you mentioned comes into play here. If Congress has approved of what the president is doing or expressly or implicitly authorized the president to do it, then the president operates in what courts call Zone 1, where his power is at its maximum. Conversely, if Congress expressly or implicitly seems to be disapproving of what the president has done, that puts us in Zone 3, where the president's acts are, I wouldn't say presumptively, but let's just say the president's power is at its lowest ebb, and it's highly questionable whether the president is acting constitutionally. And this leaves us with a middle zone And I joke with students about this because they come to law school and they don't realize that the term Twilight Zone is actually a legal term for it. If Congress is silent on a certain matter, then courts say, well, then we're operating in a quote-unquote zone of twilight where we just have to let history be our guide. This is the type of an area where the president has unilaterally made decisions throughout our history without too much of a fuss, then maybe we'll let it go. On the other hand, if Congress is silent on an issue, and it seems to be domestic policymaking, then courts are very hesitant to let the president operate in that zone. So with regard to the executive order, the reason this is frankly, it's a mess legally, is that there are two separate statutes. There is a statute from 1952 passed by Congress that appears to give the president virtually unfettered authority to exclude whatever he wants from the United States as long as he finds it to be appropriate to do that. On the other hand, there's a statute passed by Congress in 1965 that expressly says that with regard to visa applications, the executive branch is not allowed to discriminate on the basis of national origin, which would seem to indicate that the executive order in specifying 7 specific countries has run afoul of the law. So here you have one statute that seems to put the president in zone 1. You have another statute that seems to put the president in zone 3. And what it's come down to, courts have said in the course of this litigation, there was a district judge out in the state of Washington. That's a U.S. district judge, by the way. A lot of the media is reporting that as it was a state judge. It was not a state judge. It was a U.S. federal judge who happens to be in Washington. He issued an opinion. That opinion was appealed to the Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. And what those courts found is no matter where we are with all these zones, Congress cannot authorize the president to do something unconstitutional, and the president can't do something that violates some other part of the Constitution any more than Congress can. And I'd be happy to discuss these areas too, but just to sort of lay it out and then throw it back to you, Chris. The 3 issues that have come up as far as whether courts are going to restrain this executive order are, number 1, the Establishment Clause. The government is not allowed to favor one religion over others. Number 2, the Equal Protection Clause, which requires, the name suggests, that the government not be picking on certain people for arbitrary reasons. And then finally, the Due Process Clause, which requires that before the government act against somebody by taking away their liberty or their property, and arguably visas and green cards might fall into that category, it has to provide certain steps, including notice and a hearing and an impartial decision maker. So those 3 areas, Establishment Clause, Equal Protection, and Due Process, have been the undoing of the executive order, because courts have found that, or at least arguably, they have said that it's a viable argument that the executive order violates 1, 2, or all 3 of those provisions. So that's where things stand now with that litigation.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because this definitely can be confusing, and it's not as black and white as some people may believe. So I think it's really important that people understand that there are a lot of complexities that come into interpreting the Constitution as well as understanding constitutional law. Now, when it comes to constitutional law in general, and not specifically in this case per se, if someone wants to delve a little bit deeper into the Constitution, into constitutional law, especially as things like this come up, instead, of course, they could just pick up the Constitution and start reading it. But are there things that they could do to start that process for themselves, to be able to better understand some of the complexities that you are talking about and not get lost along the way before they enter law school?
Yes. It's interesting, though. The field of constitutional law sort of cries out for some level of instruction. I appreciate what you said about the complexity of these issues. You might say there are a lot of moving parts here. And you often hear people saying in the media, well, you should just apply the Constitution, just apply what it says and move on. And now here's the problem. The Constitution uses words like liberty, words like equal protection, words like full faith and credit, words like interstate commerce, And the problem with these words is that they're very broad and very general. And a word like liberty, for example, courts have to figure out what that means. It's easy enough to say, when we look at some of the marriage rights that have come up and abortion rights, and not to inject too much controversy here, but those things. It's true that the Constitution does not specifically mention issues like that, but it does guarantee liberty. And so what lawyers are always trying to figure out is whether those things that I just mentioned are a component of liberty, which certainly is mentioned in the Constitution multiple times. And so I guess as far as learning about the Constitution, there are problems with both the text itself and with Supreme Court opinions that we teach from our casebooks in constitutional law courses. And the main problem is that it's antiquated language. You're going to find the use of words and spelling and sentence construction that no longer prevails. And it can feel like you're reading a bit of a foreign language. But nonetheless, certainly there are sources out there. I would recommend for anybody who really wants to delve into it that they look at the Federalist Papers, which is the leading historical source of guidance as to what the Constitution means. The Federalist Papers were drafted by three of our founding fathers back when the Constitution was being debated, and they were trying to persuade people to support the Constitution, and in so doing, opined as to what the Constitution means. So that's been a very helpful source. But I do tell students when they come into class, the constitutional law is an area where upon your first reading of the material, it's likely to be very confusing, and that's what professors are for, at least we hope, is to take some really complicated material interpreting some very general language and help students make sense of it. I will say this, though. This is the time, and I've been telling students this too, I rarely have seen as much attention paid to the law in our popular media and in terms of the news and that media as I've seen this last few weeks. It turns out, and I was telling people this before the election, this election was the most important election of my lifetime for the court, and that's because we have three justices right now, in addition to Justice Scalia, who's passed away. We have Justice Ginsburg, who's 83, we have Justice Kennedy, who's 80, and we have Justice Breyer, who's 78. And those are two liberals and a swing vote on the court. And so we're looking at the possibility here of a very sharp swing to the right on the Supreme Court in terms of social issues. And what that means is that some of the things that we thought were settled, I didn't think were settled, but a lot of people thought were settled, like abortion, the right to terminate a pregnancy, marriage rights, things like that, where we thought maybe things were heading in one direction and we're going to stay that way. Those things are going to be back with a vengeance. And so we're going to need civil rights lawyers. Obviously, with all of the goings-on around Muslim Americans and immigrants, we're going to need immigration lawyers. And so it's a very interesting time. I was just telling all three of my, I meet with three groups to teach certain different subjects last week. And in all three of them, I said, the law is back. When you actually have people on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC talking about the law and all turning to each other, trying to find a lawyer to explain what's going on. Never seen this much attention paid to it. And in that sense, no matter what side of the political divide somebody is on, I think that one positive we can take out of this is people are engaged and people are noticing how important it is to have lawyers who are well-trained and thoughtful to sort of have the grown-up conversations that we had about some of these issues that have come up in the last few weeks. So I think this is the most interesting time in my professional career to look at being a lawyer.
This definitely is a very unique time in history and a unique time for individuals to be considering the law, but also looking at the legal matters within the United States, abroad, and beyond. And I appreciate you sharing all of this today. And I'm going to put some links in our notes to be able to help people to be able to connect with some of the resources that you shared. I'm going to link into that article that you wrote about the travel ban and the executive orders aspect and looking at the constitutionality of those. And I really appreciate you being on the show today and sharing your expertise. And we'll definitely have to have you back on again soon.
No problem. It's my pleasure. I was happy to do it.
Well, that was another great guest this week on the Law School Insider. If you have an interest in being a guest on the show, drop me an email at lawschoolinsider@cooley.edu. And thank you all for listening today, and remember, you have the ability and right to take control of your law school's success. I hope you'll continue listening, creating a plan for success that will prepare you to achieve the dreams that you have set for yourself. Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. You're on your way to being a Law School Insider. Please subscribe to stay connected and come back again next time as we speak to more students, lawyers, and employers.